In today's video, we're going to be looking at conservation for A-level biology. If you see a certain point on this page that you want to take a look at, take a look in the video description below to see the respective timestamps. Otherwise, let's go ahead and get started with why species become extinct. So the first point that we're going to look at is due to habitat loss and degradation. So firstly, what is a habitat? A habitat is simply the environment where an organism or where a species lives in and thrives in. Now, if we have habitat loss, that will simply mean that the habitat will be eliminated or destroyed. If, for example, we have a forest where a species is living in, and we cut all of the trees down, and that species can't adapt, it can't find a new forest to live in, it will die because it has nowhere to live. Habitat degradation, it refers to the worsening of a habitat. So if we have that forest again and we start polluting it with plastic, maybe we put some form of chemical in the forest, and animals from within that forest eat. Maybe they confuse the plastic with their food source. They can eat the plastic and then they'll die. And that can have a knock-on effect because, as we know, in an ecosystem, everything is tightly knitted. It's a tight-knit relationship. And so if one species starts dying off because it's eating the plastic, that could result in extinction of that specific species, and possibly it could have a knock-on effect on the next species within the food chain. We then also have climate change. So climate change happens as a result of the burning of fossil fuels, which release greenhouse gases. Now, greenhouse gases contribute to global warming. And with climate change, what happens is the weather patterns begin changing. We could start seeing more extreme weather conditions, like, for example, droughts, tornadoes, maybe fires because of extreme heat. In the case of a fire, again, we have a large forest. Due to climate change, due to adverse weather conditions, that forest could be completely destroyed. Maybe a wildfire occurs, and all of the organisms within that forest would pass away. And if all of the animals from within a species lived in that one forest, and the wildfire took out that entire forest, that species would unfortunately become extinct. We then have competition. So, as the human population is now more than 8 billion people, we're having to build more and more houses. And as we extend our cities and as we extend our towns into wild areas, there is less space where wild animals can live in. And so there is more competition between each species for food. And this competition will lead to extinction of the weaker individuals, of the weaker species. And finally, we have hunting by humans. So humans will hunt animals, maybe due to their skin. Maybe they want to have the horn of the rhinoceros, right, for ivory. And in doing so, they can overhunt and overkill these animals, so much so that the population is reduced to a very, very small amount, and then possibly even to extinction. So these are some of the main reasons why species become extinct. Now, before actually looking at how we can protect endangered species, it's important to understand why biodiversity is important. Now, before we go forward, it's important to understand what biodiversity actually is. Biodiversity is the variety of things in the living world. Now, why is it important? We have three main points. We have the ethical, cultural, and social standpoint of view for maintaining biodiversity. If we maintain biodiversity, so if we maintain that variety, ethically and culturally speaking, it's good because in a lot of different forests, there may be indigenous people. And by maintaining those forests intact, we are not disrupting the lives of those indigenous people. From an ethical standpoint of view, what right would we have to deforest a certain area and in doing so kill the indigenous people? Those indigenous people have the same right to life as we do. Culturally speaking, by maintaining the forests, we're maintaining heritage, right? Trees and all of these different plants and animals have been on the planet for so long. A tree, for example, can be 100 years old. By maintaining that tree intact, we are maintaining the culture. Socially speaking, by having biodiversity, by having variety, it's much nicer from an aesthetic point of view. When you go outside and you see all of this different fauna and flora, it is much nicer than if you were to see only some concrete and maybe a little bit of grass. Ecologically speaking, by maintaining biodiversity, by maintaining variety, we are keeping the ecosystems intact. And ecosystems contribute to recycling nature, to recycling nutrients. So if we can maintain biodiversity, we keep intact the ecosystems, and in doing so, we keep intact the habitats, which will in turn keep intact and keep alive all of the species that live inside of those habitats. And then finally, we have economically speaking. So by maintaining biodiversity, by maintaining variety in the living world, we are safeguarding our future. A lot of products that we use on a day-to-day basis originate from organisms, from live organisms, right? If we think about it, the apples that we eat, they come from plants. They come from trees. The medicines that we use, they come from a lot of different plants. So by maintaining this variety, we are safeguarding our future. For example, in the future, there may be a certain disease. And in order to find a cure, we're going to need to harvest that cure. We're going to need to harvest the chemicals from a specific organism. On top of the medicinal benefits and also the textile benefits, etc., like we use wood. By maintaining trees, we're also safeguarding our wood source in the future. On top of all of these, by maintaining biodiversity, it can have a very positive impact for a country that has a high biodiversity because of ecotourism. Where there is a lot of biodiversity and a lot of variety, people might actually want to come to that country and visit it in order to experience and in order to see the beautiful nature. So that's the economic standpoint of view by maintaining biodiversity. Now, before we move on to looking at what we can do to protect endangered species in order to maintain biodiversity, let's quickly take a look at CITES and IUCN. So CITES is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. Now, this convention isn't obligatory. Countries can choose to participate in it or not. But when they do choose to participate in the convention, it becomes legally binding in that respective country. Now, the aim of the CITES is to prevent the threat that international trade has on these wild species. The IUCN is the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and they basically assess and they place it in one of 9 categories of the red list. So they create a red list, and that red list has 9 categories, ranging from not evaluated to extinct. Conservationists can then use that red list to then decide, do we need to place this specific species in a conserved area? Do we need to actually take care of this species in order to regenerate its wild population? So now that we know why biodiversity is important, let's take a look at some methods that we can use to protect endangered species. So one of the first things that we could do is we could make conserved areas. So these are things like national parks or marine parks, where we legally safeguard specific habitats, maybe one habitat or maybe a variety of different habitats, and they are patrolled by wardens. So this will enable the species that live in those habitats to grow, to survive, and to reproduce. We also can use zoos and botanical gardens. So zoos and botanical gardens are more for species that are either very close to being extinct in the wild, or they are extinct in the wild. And what the zoos and botanical gardens will do is that they will provide a space for where these endangered species can safely survive and then reproduce to pass on their genetic information. Zoos and botanical gardens also have the benefit that a lot of conservationists work here, and so they can study the genes of those endangered species in order to possibly find a way to regenerate the wild population. What can also happen in zoos and botanical gardens is a lot of education can take place. People can come and they can see with their own eyes the animals and the plants that are endangered. And then based on that, they can possibly make choices about their daily habits that maybe affect climate change or competition on those species that are there endangered. And one of the final things that zoos and botanical gardens achieve is that they can do captive breeding programs. So here, the animals, the endangered animals, will have a safe space where they can reproduce. And then over time, once the captive population increases in number, some of those individuals can be released back into the wild in order to try and regenerate that wild population, because that is the end goal. We also have seed, embryo, and sperm banks. So the embryo and sperm banks are called frozen zoos. And this is where the seeds, embryo, and sperms will be frozen and preserved for use at a later date. Now, for embryo, sperm, and ova, we can do cryopreservation, which is where we store them in liquid nitrogen at negative 196 degrees Celsius. For seeds, in order to prevent germination as they're being stored, we have their moisture content reduced by about 4 to 6% before storing them in deep freeze chambers at a temperature between negative 18 degrees Celsius and negative 20 degrees Celsius. Now, some methods that we can use for assisted reproduction. So they all kind of tie in with one another, but let's quickly start off with IVF, which is in vitro fertilization. So this is where we treat a female with gonadotrophins, and those gonadotrophins stimulate the production of oocytes. Now, the oocytes will then be aspired, so they will be extracted from the uterus of the female, and then they will be fertilized with a genetically different sperm from a male donor, and then we will get an embryo. Now, embryo transfer is when we take out the embryo from one uterus and we place it into the uterus of another female. And that is also similar to surrogacy. So surrogacy will be where one female will grow, right? It will home the embryo of another female. So IVF, surrogacy, and embryo transfer all kind of tie in with one another. So that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, I'm glad. Take a look at some of the other content on my YouTube channel that might interest you. Otherwise, thanks very much for watching, and I hope you have a great day. Bye-bye.